effectively begun. So let me have your attention, please. So everybody, we're doing this particular PowerPoint, which we'll get this done today. So everybody, I got the recording that I sent was really the remainder of the nerve, anatomy of the nerve, dendrites, axon, cell body. We're basically dealing with multipolar nerves. So, I mean, it was really, it lent itself to basically, it's just basically me reading the PowerPoint with getting into a whole lot of information about it. So it's not a major area, but for the sake of completeness, I wanted to send it to you and make sure that that you got all of that information. And you all have the study guide that I recorded and sent. I wanted to get those done sufficient so we had the full week to study for everybody. So that's it. Questions, anything, shoot me an email, whatever information you need. I'm happy to work with you. All that, hold on. We're getting there. And nevertheless, we're doing this one. This is really the electrical functionality of the nerve. So it's the electrophysiology more than anything else that's here. And it's really useful because it does make a few points. And we're skipping a lot of the stuff. There's a lot of physics in this I don't do. So they're talking about electricity and ohms and resistance, and I don't do that. So again, it's not a whole lot different than the other cell. We'll reiterate or revisit the resting membrane potential here. And the whole idea of nerve and muscle cells, they're very excitable, and nerves even more so than muscle cells. These work very similarly. That should reinforce what you learned and what you're studying for the exam next week. So, and this is the electricity stuff, not doing it, not doing voltage and potential and resistance and current, go home with ohm, whatever. But it's, again, the basis, again, is all about something we did early in the cell. Way back in the first third of the course, we did resting membrane potential. And, the whole idea of the leakage or non-gated channels, which are always open, versus the gated, we cover those. And it's just, you're going to see, we're really not going to talk about mechanically at all. And chemically, the perfect example of those was the neuromuscular junction, where the acetylcholine opened a specific gate to allow inflow of sodium and outflow of potassium to create those end plate potentials. And we're going to revisit again, really important today, voltage gated channels, because this is really how that action potential spreads. It's different. In a muscle cell, for instance, if that muscle is triggered here, anywhere on that muscle fiber, let's say in the middle of it, it goes in every direction. It's multi-directional. It doesn't know any boundary. It goes this way, it goes that way, it goes forward, back, all the way around. All those neat little T-tubules bring the signal in. In a nerve, if I have that long tail of the nerve that transmits the axon, whether I trigger it where it starts at the hillock, or really the center where what they call the triggering zone, as you'll see on the animation, or anywhere along it, it's unidirectional. It's only going to go that way. And you're going to see that's because of these voltage-gated sodium channels. And you saw a little bit of it in an illustration on that neat little thing that kind of hung down underneath it, called an inactivation gate. We look at that closely today. Frankly, it's not something that I think is test heavy at this point in time. And it's certainly nothing that's going to be on the test you're taking on Monday, a week from today. But it really gives you, this is really the foundation for understanding something called the absolute and then the relative refractory periods. Once you get to cardiovascular, is everything. Really very, very important. That's the foundation for this, and here are the different channels. Great. We will, you get this, you'll get to these when you look at the ear, you look at mechanically gated channel. When you look at the eye, you look about vision gated channels. Guys, good. I'm in a bad enough mood with the Steelers. Please. There were issues last night. It's not often I turn off a Steelers game, but that was one I was turning off. My wife said, I told you you're going to bed. I have to be up at 5:40 in the morning. You don't. Didn't matter. She yelled at me. I knew it was bad when she stopped screaming at the set. But we digress. So here are pictures of the channels. How neat. And God, the front row, please, no more talking. I don't want to have to say that again. This is not a freaking high school. Please. All right. So the resting membrane potential is just that. It is a resting potential. Okay. Minus 70 millivolts. Typically, there's variations in the nervous system. That's what's meant by polarity. All cells are polarized. It's very straightforward. It has to do with the ions in the intra and extracellular fluid. Those are acronyms to be familiar with. I'll probably spell it out on a test. You could certainly ask me on a test, but not everybody's like that. And permeability. Obviously, it's much more permeable to potassium. Why? More leakage channels. And you're going to see this in the animation when you're going to show you what the voltmeter is actually like and what it's doing. Understand this whole idea of positive on the outside, negative on the inside is just across the membrane. The interior of the cell is neutral. The exterior out here is neutral. It's balanced. It's just across the membrane where we have polarity. We don't have cells that are inherently positively charged or negatively charged. It's all about the membrane, and all cells have the capability, theoretically, of being able to fire, but they don't, just particularly nerve and muscle cells. And then here's the axon, this transmitter. Let's say it's going from here to here, and we could check it anywhere along it because effectively it's equal. Again, always more sodium outside the cell, more potassium inside the cell. That has a lot to do with those leakage channels. Chloride is the ion that balances out the sodium outside the cell, and effectively it neutralizes. You're going to see chloride moves very easily. Not today, but when we meet again on Wednesday and certainly on Friday, we're going to look at neurotransmitters. One of the channels that they open up are called chloride-gated channels. Chloride is negative. If they push that into the cell, it makes it a lot less likely to fire. That's really important. And if you did not know, the sort of the framework is that's how things like sedatives work. That's how alcohol works. It opens specifically what are called chloride-gated channels. So it's not innocent, but for the time being, it's just neutralizing the sodium abundance outside. Inside the cell, and these can't exit the cell unless the cell is severely damaged, are proteins. Proteins are made of long chains of amino acids. Many of those it's all of those amino acids that allow it to be soluble inside the cell. When an acid is put in water, basically it makes it an acid, it gives up that proton. Well, the proton is a hydrogen plus. That means what's left of it has a minus charge. And so effectively, acids, when we dissolve them, this is really an important little bit of chemistry for those of you who are going on to micro, because in the lab, you'll talk about acidic and basic dyes. And it has to do with the chemistry as why they dye certain things or not dye certain things. It's a lab related type of thing. And we talk about it a little bit when we look at like bacterial cells in lecture. So the intracellular fluid has a higher concentration of potassium, and it's offset by the negative charge of the proteins. And yeah, potassium is the winner. First animation, there's 3.
The human brain alone contains about 100 billion nerve cells called neurons. A neuron, like all cells, has negatively and positively charged ions in the fluids located both inside and outside of the cell. However, the ionic composition of these two fluids is markedly different. The inner surface of the membrane is negatively charged, while the outer surface is positively charged. This unequal distribution of charge creates a voltage across the plasma membrane, known as the membrane potential. In a resting, unstimulated neuron, this membrane potential is known specifically as the resting membrane potential. The value of the resting membrane potential depends on 2 factors. The first is the presence of concentration gradients across the plasma membrane, especially those gradients for sodium and potassium ions. The second is the permeability of the plasma membrane to sodium and potassium. In the resting state, this permeability depends on the number of non-gated leak channels present in the membrane for these ions. The magnitude of the resting membrane potential, inside relative to outside, is measured in millivolts using a voltmeter and 2 electrodes. We'll now place both electrodes in the extracellular fluid. Note that the voltmeter records zero voltage. This is because the unequal distribution of charge exists only across the plasma membrane. The intra and extracellular fluids are otherwise electrically neutral. However, when we insert one of the electrodes into the intracellular fluid, a voltage is recorded. The value of the resting membrane potential varies, but on average it is minus 70 millivolts.
So that's just giving you an idea of what they mean. It's when that's measuring effectively across the membrane to give you that idea. All right, we don't want to see it again. And here, this is a little out of sequence. So all the time, potassiums are going out and sodium is going in, constantly working. When the nerve fires, it's amazing. Thousands of these, and this what you look at here is that sodium-potassium pump, get very, very busy. Even when the nerve is at rest, and any cell is at rest, there's still activity. So there's always a little bit of energy expenditure that's involved. It just becomes dramatically increased when a nerve fires. So nerves do rest. I mean, you're not using all parts of your brain in any given time, but still these pumps require periodically inputs of energy for the pumps to work. And again, remember the 3-to-2 relationship. When the pumps, they're pumping sodium that has flowed in out and bringing potassium back in. 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums. Effectively, it's based on their size more than anything else. Even so, because sodiums are a tad smaller than potassiums. At the motor end plate, it's the opposite. When you open that ligand-gated channel we talked about in muscles, that's important for the upcoming test. You have 3 sodiums come in, 2 potassiums go out. That's what effectively generates those things we call end plate potentials. More about that and some of the differences between nerve muscle physiology and nerve physiology we're going to get to. So again, the proteins can't get through. 25 times more permeable to potassium because there's more channels. And again, the chloride will play a role down the road, but not today. Okay, we'll be looking at that later. The more potassium diffuses out, sodium diffuses in. That's the membrane potential. And again, we're constantly having to compensate. That's an electrical event, and you're going to see electrical events have to be offset by chemical events. Because you're going to see when it fires, those have to get very busy to restore those chemical concentrations, or theoretically it couldn't fire again. So they're constantly busy. And this just shows you here's the pump. I don't get a lot out of this particular graphic. I can't read it. I can't whatsoever. You have potassium going out. You have sodium going in. There's 2 of those. They're just trying to show you there's more of these than these. And here are the pumps. We saw this before. Not helpful here. So membrane potentials change when the ions across the membrane change and the permeability does. Basically, when these changes occur, you basically have 2 types of potentials. In the nerve muscle matter, we call them end plate potentials. What's unique about nerve and muscle, the acetylcholine only has one message to the muscle, that part of the muscle. It's telling it to fire. If there's enough acetylcholine over a sufficient amount of time, and it raises it to the level of threshold, it will fire. There's no mixed messages. Acetylcholine only is what we call excitability, more likely to fire. So we use the term end plate potentials. They're always getting closer to the threshold. Not so in a nerve. Nerves converse with one another with 2 simple messages: fire or don't fire. There's many neurotransmitters. That's what we're going to start on Wednesday. These neurotransmitters have different messages. Some are telling it to fire. We call them depolarizing. We'll get to the terminology, making it more likely to fire. Some less likely to fire. It depends on the chemical they give off. They don't all give off acetylcholine. There's a whole myriad of those. You're going to probably have to learn about 10 of them that do different things. I'm sorry. It's part of the course. Why I'm not sorry for many of you, you go into any courses about pharmacology or how things work. This is where we attack things in the human body, particularly in the nerve and muscle system, by using things that affect neurotransmitters. It's extraordinarily important. This is the basis for all that. So we don't even call them end plate potentials. One, no end plate. So we just have graded potentials. More likely to fire, less likely. And what happens is the nerve's it's conversing. If they have enough voices telling you do this, do this, do this, as opposed to don't do this, and it reaches a certain amount, I'm overwhelmed by these voices telling me to fire, it's going to fire. We call that an action potential. Graded potential make localized changes. It's a weak signal. It can't travel very far. Action potentials travel a greater distance. I mean, here, these local potentials might go border to here, or even maybe a little wider from here to here. Action potential travels far enough that it reaches an area where there's an abundance of this very, very powerful sodium voltage gated channels, a mass of them that allow extremely large quantities of sodium, and then a mass that kick out large quantities of potassium. And that's the action potential. Once it hits there, the signal can't be stopped. I was going to say unstoppable, but however you can get. You heard that one before. It's okay. I appreciate your effort in smiling. You're all unhappy the Steelers lost. I'll keep it that way rather than ignoring me. I'm convinced the only one who loves me in the house at times is the dog. That's joking. Changes in membrane potential are used as signals. Receive, integrate, sending, obviously. Here's the distinctions. Depolarization, more likely to fire. The inside becomes less negative or more positive. The whole idea, if the resting membrane potential is minus 70, we want to get to minus 55 or 50, that area. And once it hits whatever that number is, boom, fires completely, can't be stopped. And it's an immediate response. These are extraordinarily fast. The whole cycle of fire and reset, 3 or 4 milliseconds. Think of how many signals you can get in a second, much less a fraction of a second. So it increases the likelihood that that impulse is going to cause something to fire. Hyperpolarization. If it's polarized, there's a gap between positive and negative. If we hyperpolarize it, we increase the gap. This is done by making the interior along the membrane more negative. So then the resting. So it's not minus 70, it's minus 75, it's minus 80, whatever the number is arbitrary. So it makes the probability of producing that impulse or that action potential much less likely. Fire, don't fire. That's all. So the names that they give fancy: depolarization, hyperpolarization. Personally, I think better terms, and I use these more, anything like this, we call that excitable, and this is inhibitory. More likely to fire, less likely to fire. Again, acetylcholine to neuromuscular junction only says fire. It's the only language it understands. Because there's only one neurotransmitter. And you're going to see it in the brain, it's different. In different systems, acetylcholine sometimes has different messages to different structures. So it's just showing you here, if this threshold is up here, just getting it closer or getting it farther away. That's really all you have to be aware of with that. Those graded potentials, more likely to fire, less likely to fire, but not sufficient to be an action potential, can make some changes. The stronger the stimulus, the more it's going to carry, the farther, but it's not going to get close enough, as I was trying to demonstrate before, to get all the way up to where those abundance of voltage gated channels are. So they open up the gated ion channels, resulting in local depolarization and sometimes even hyperpolarization. And I don't go into receptor potentials or postsynaptic potentials for you folks. Too confusing. This is a better illustration. What effectively is doing this isolated potential. In this case, this is a stimulus that's going to depolarize a very tiny area along this axon that could be a meter long. And what it does, normally, this is what it's like. Positive on the outside, negative on the inside, same anywhere along the membrane. It's taking this one isolated area and flipping it. And when it flips it, not only do you have electrical force, not only do you have the forces of the chemicals that are beginning to change, but this becomes an electrical force. This positive is going to be inducing the adjacent negatives to also flip. And that's what happens. That's where the chain reactions start. If we get it far enough in whichever direction it is going, where the abundance of these big voltage gated channels are, then it will carry on completely. So this is a small patch. Okay, it spreads from one area to another. The trouble is it's limited. You can see the way it's doing. You see these have now, not the one that was here. Now we have the adjacent two have flipped, and it's trying to flip these other ones, but it's very localized. What happens is it flows, but it dissipates quickly and decays. So it's short distance signals. The distance is the key. You're going to see that. In order for it to, and they're going to show you the next animation, in order for that action potential to occur, all of those fire or don't fire signals, typically in a nerve, are going to come in the receptor area, and that was in the what I recorded presentation, called the dendrite. They're going to arrive and be processed. How many of this? How many fires? How many don't fires? Got plenty of fires. And what they call the trigger zone, which anatomically is the axon hillock, a little mound in the axon at its beginning, and it proceeds very rapidly from there. So this is what happens with decay. If it's just a depolarizing signal, it'll change it from its resting potential, but not enough, and it'll dissipate. It's a short distance signal, but an action potential, the way nerves send signal, long distances. We only see these in nerve and muscle cells, period. It's a startlingly dramatic increase in the potential. It's a big change, 100 millivolts. It's an enormous change comparatively, so much so it does not decay. It's so strong, it creates that area of the membrane a wave that carries down it. And you're going to see why unlike muscle, which go in every direction, this is just one direction. So we call it a nerve impulse, fine. Open specific voltage gated channels. They're the ones that are in large clusters and create this unstoppable wave. This is the big deal. You're going to see this shortly. We looked at these before a little bit, but it didn't play a big role in the muscle. Not enough. So muscle resets itself. We don't use muscle as rapidly as we use nerves. So really, the fact that this existed, it did not create a problem. We just don't use the muscles mechanically that quickly. On the sodium voltage gated channels, we have this inactivation gate. It's typically in the open position. The gate here that allows the sodium to flow in is closed when it's at rest. When it opens, when the electrical signal passes by, it opens it. The gate's not in the way, this inactivation gate, and it allows it to flow in. Once the sodium has flowed in and it's reached the next set, which are the potassium channels, it starts to reverse the process. This inactivation gate swings over. Even though the gateway technically is open, the inactivation gate is a barrier. And it can't get through the barrier. If we put a transparent plastic screen in front of that doorway, we could see what's out there, but it can't get through. That's like an inactivation gate. Not so on the next series where they're heading. Potassium either is closed or opens. That's all. This is the guy. Because it's closing, it's not allowing the signal to go in any other direction but where the next series of these voltage gated channels are. And they're only what they call downstream, from where it started going toward the tip of the axon, or if it's a sensory signal from where it came in going back toward the cell body. So these all gated sodium potassium channels are closed when the nerve is at rest. Only those leakage channels are there. The only thing that's really active are those sodium potassium pumps when they need to be. Each sodium channel has 2 voltage sensitive gates. Closed at rest, opens with depolarization, that's the signal to fire, allowing sodium to enter cell. The inactivation gates are still open at rest, but they block the channel once it is open and sufficient sodium has flown through it swings over and blocks it. And the potassium is either open or closed. So at rest, this is it. You can see the electrical design. This is basically showing the action potential. None here. Resting membrane potential. Nothing's flowing in, nothing's flowing out. Those are the gateways that are closed. When it's sufficient to depolarize, understanding this is an action potential, not a local potential. The currents open those voltage gated channels. As sodium rushes in, they activate. The inactivation gates are open when this is happening. Leads to more depolarization, more channels, becomes decidedly less negative or more positive. Okay, and assuming it reaches the threshold, it generates that giant spike and that big 100 millivolt jump. Voila, everything's flowing in, sodium is still blocked, can't get out. Immediately, the next, basically that it's ensured that signal is going to go in the direction here next. The repolarization is the potassium going out. The inactivation gates close. Sodium can't get through. It stops the spike. The potassium channels open. It exits because there's more potassium inside than outside. And we call that repolarization. So it's on its way down. Here's the inactivation gate. Even though theoretically it could flow, it can't get past the barrier. These are open. It's flowing out. Interestingly, there's an overshoot. This tendency to overshoot, if this, basically in this situation, we have what's called an absolute refractory period. We can't get more sodium in from these areas. That's what it means it's refractory. We can't re-trigger that part of the nerve. We can't send another nerve signal. What happens is, as the potassium channels remain open, the sodium channels reset. Okay, some potassium channels allow an excessive amount. So typically there's a little overshoot. As the membrane becomes more negative than in the resting state, we call that hyperpolarization, that little dip. The sodium channels are resetting, but when it dips, starting roughly about here, as it begins to dip, this is the start of what's called a relative refractory period. The implication is it takes more signal coming in. It takes more of instructions to fire to basically fire the nerve. This doesn't mean they can't fire, it just takes a little bit more. You're in an emergency situation, you have to react quickly. This is the type of situation where we'll produce an abundance of signals. Whatever the emergency is, your body kind of goes into hyperdrive when it has to. And they show it to you. There's another animation forthcoming. And again, these are too small for me to look at.
Neurons communicate over long distances by generating and sending electrical signals called action potentials. Most action potentials originate in the axon's initial segment, a region also called the trigger zone. During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close, thus altering the membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes.
See, I'm sorry to click that for me, backspace again. I was trying to show you or demonstrate there.
During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium.
Look closely there at those inactivation gates as they flip back up.
The membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes.
So it's sequential.
It polarizes from the resting state of minus 70 millivolts to a peak value of plus 30 millivolts, and then quickly repolarizes back to minus 70 millivolts after a brief period of hyperpolarization.
In roughly 4 milliseconds. The whole thing.
In this topic, we explore, step by step, the events that occur as an action potential is generated in the axon's initial segment.
And that's kind of what we just went over to demonstrate that first the sodium, then the potassium. And you'll see in the next animation, which is the best, how this really occurs. Repolarization is a reset button. Again, it's not ionic or chemical conditions. Those terms are interchangeable. Ions are charged particles that are dissolved, charged particles of chemicals dissolved in water. So again, the electrical event, in order we have to reset the cell, the sodium going in and potassium going out, kind of reset the cell, depolarization and repolarization. The repolarization was the reset electrically, the sodium, potassium pump, and thousands of them in an axon. And imagine the tens of billions of axons that you have all over your body. How much energy is needed to reset those, for those pumps to constantly work? It's immense. Keep telling everybody you utilize about as much ATP, breaking it down and building it up, as you weigh every single day. Whether you're taking it easy, whether you're active, or you're throwing things at the TV set like I was last night. I have a little sponge. Throw. See, you guys weren't as torn apart by this as I was. Here's that one with the sodium potassium pumps. Don't have to go over it again. And not all depolarization events produce action potentials. It's an all or none phenomenon. Those fire, don't fire things, we don't register them. That's inside your body. You're thinking, you're assessing anything, and until you decide to take some kind of action. That's necessary. Most time we do a lot of unconsciously. Whatever you're doing now, whether you're writing something down, whether you're listening, whether something else has caught your attention, that's fine. But when you finally decide, I want to do this, or I have to respond to this text, or I better go out and take a call, whatever that is, now basically the decision is made and you've involved action. That's the fire. At threshold, the membrane is depolarized by 15 to 20 millivolts on average. The vast increase in sodium, you hit that massive amount of voltage-gated channels for sodium. Sodium influx exceeds potassium efflux, effectively called self-propagating or self-amplifying. That's what positive feedback is. It gets bigger and keeps going until the nerve has fired. That's the end of the event, and we start the whole process over again. That's what positive feedback is. You know, negative feedback in this case, which makes no sense at all, it would start the fire, then, oh, I better stop. I mean, you and I might change our mind about something, but the nerve, once that action potential is activated, it's going to fire. So it's an all or none principle. That's there. The propagation transmits it down its entire length or wherever the axon is, typically, again, at that trigger zone or hillock. It flows through the voltage gated in one membrane area, local currents that cause gates and adjacent, and so on and so on and so on. And that's what happens. It's self-propagating. Non-myelinated is a little bit different than myelinated, as you will see shortly. Okay? Propagation and myelination is a jumping kind of thing. You're going to see the term. I'll write it out for you. Anyway, that's here. It appears to jump. It appears is the right way to explain it. Saltatory or leaping or jumping conduction. Again, it's more of an illusion, but it's an easy way to explain it. So it's called saltatory conduction. And this is something we see only in myelinated nerves. And it will be able to address why the more myelin, the better. Bigger nerves, thicker nerves, diameter-wise, thicker myelination, the fastest nerves you got. 25, 50, 100 times faster or more than other nerves, than non-myelinated nerves. Those are those signals that basically you're using when you're grabbing something to write it down. You're entering something on a keyboard, whatever you're doing. So it shows what happens here and the propagation and the rapid change of the voltage. You don't get, and there's not a lot special in those illustrations. This is the best of the animation. I got to turn sound down.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers
Great
of
view of the
tightly
thickness
wrapped
of
glial
myelin.
cell membrane. But this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way. Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
And we can measure these things, and that's when we talked about in muscles, when you saw those myograms and the twitches and the staircasing, all that jazz. And we can do this, and it's done in the lab. You have something, a pad here, or a lead here and a lead here. You stimulate here. You know the distance. You measure it, and when this lead responds, when you get a signal there, you can see how rapid, and just a fraction of a second, what the distance is. You can count. 100 is conservative. Depending on the authors you read, you can get 100, 150, 200 meters a second. Extraordinarily fast. Which gives you a clue when we get to looking at neurotransmitters, and we look at the thing we're going to look at on Wednesday, the synapse, the space between them. That's the rate determining step. Again, you and I can talk to somebody in California real time. But for us to get there, even on a jet plane, it's going to take us 4 hours. So that, even though it says 200 meters per second, I did the math, and you can do the math just easily. I just forget what it was. 350, 400, 500 miles an hour. The reality is that nerves run much faster than that, but it's that chemicals being secreted and triggering the next nerve over really takes the time. So see, I like to think of it that way. How quickly do we were around the world with an electrical signal almost instantaneously. But for us to get there, it takes quite a bit longer. So, and it's all of it because the action potentials are identical. In muscles, they're not. They're similar. Frequency is really what will increase that muscle and staircase it. But basically, you're getting to a point where you're bringing in more calcium into that muscle fiber. And again, when we looked at that graphically, it's different because once you get the signal enough that it's going to fire all of those motor units. It doesn't matter if that's a level of 5, you crank it up to 7, 10, 12, 15, it's not going to fire the muscle anymore. You've reached your maximum. The nervous system is totally like that. Every action potential is identical, independent of stimulus intensity. So the difference between loud, if it's something was like this morning, really cold, that's signals coming in rapidly. If you walked into the room and it was fairly warm or comfortable, your body would be getting, oh, it's not too bad in here. Is it loud, soft, hot, cold, sharp, dull, whatever? All of those signals, the magnitude is all about frequency. So frequency equals amplitude, the number of frequencies. So it doesn't matter whether we have, so here you have a mild stimulus, here you have a big stimulus, both over threshold. Here, 4 units. Here, how many you ever have there? 10? So your body's interpreting that rapid regeneration of signal as its amplitude, how much it hurt, how loud it was, as opposed to how soft it was. So the refractory period is when it can't trigger again. The voltage gated channels are open, but they cannot respond to another stimulus because that inactivation gate is there. So this quote, absolute refractory period. And in the heart, we're talking a quarter of a second. Here we're talking 1 or 2 milliseconds. There we're talking 250 milliseconds. It works similarly, but not identically. Time from opening of sodium channels until resetting of the channels ensures that each action potential is an all or none event and one-way event. That's what's so important about those inactivation gates. Yeah, I doubt I'll ask more than a question about this. I'm not going to talk about the heart or anything else on this final exam material. But I'm trying to give you the foundation to understand AP2. The relative refractory period follows. Most sodium channels have returned. Potassium channels still open. It's repolarizing. The threshold effectively is elevated. It's going to take more signal, more fire instructions for it to actually fire. So only an exceptionally strong stimulus could be able to do that, particularly when it goes into that hyperpolarization. When you have that overshoot, I have no idea what this means, but that's fine. And so graphically, you can see in a nerve, we're talking about a millisecond for absolute, and maybe a total of not quite 3 more milliseconds for relative refractory period. That's tiny comparatively. In the nervous system, maybe not so much. Again, much more dramatic in the heart. And so action potentials only occur in the axon or its start, that trigger zone, because the other nerves can trigger axon, you can connect, they can talk to nerves even at the axons when we see the complexity. And we'll see a little bit of that, I think a little bit in the next unit. Action potentials and velocities and axons vary. The big players, if it has a big diameter, inherently there's less resistance. It flows. And you saw the myelin, that really good graphic that they had in the animation. The degree of the more myelin, the thicker the nerve, and the more myelin, the faster it goes, particularly with enough myelinization that we generate really rapid saltatory, leaping, jumping conduction. So versus continuous versus saltatory, myelinated axons, now they're saying 30. I mean, I've seen all sorts of numbers in the various different materials that I've used to teach these courses. It insulates and prevents leakage. The gaps are, the sheath gaps are nodes. The thing, in the old days, we say, oh, it leaps, like jumping over the myelin. No. That area where myelin, it's insulated. Just like any wire that's there. When you have the insulation, it's easy for the signal to get through. There's no distractors coming from the outside. And the gaps are where all of those abundant amounts of those massive sodium, voltage-gated sodium channels are located. So it's basically going along the interior. It appears to jump because you see the signal kind of goes from here to here to here at each gap. But what really is happening, it's shooting through that insulated area very, very rapidly. The more myelin, the more rapidly it goes to the next area where it has a lot of those sodium voltage-gated channels. So the action potentials effectively are the gap So it appears to jump. And it shows you this stuff. So this is the big deal. This is where the channels are. Okay? And so it's racing through here, stimulating here. Racing through here, stimulating here. So it goes that much faster. This is the classic example of MS. Autoimmune disease, like all of them. Typically, the ages 15 through 55, second through fifth decades, you often get a signal early on, 3 to 4 times more likely to occur in women than in men. I said this to all the other classes. I don't see why I shouldn't say it to you. I never am dismissive of somebody. If somebody comes, unless I know they're a drug seeker or somebody who's just chronically seeking attention. Even then, I don't want to be, I'm never dismissive. I try to take people at their word when they tell me I have a problem. I mean, eventually, like all of us, you get an idea who's BSing you or not. But the reality is that from a patient's perspective, I have to accept what they're saying until I can exclude it. So in practice, it's easy to make that mistake because you get a little, I tell the story. It's my first wife, which has a terrible disease called neurofibromatosis. You wouldn't want to have it. That's the elephant man's disease. If you're interested, not that she has horrible misshapen neurofibromas all over her. So you couldn't necessarily see it. Okay. But she went to have it, and this neurologist, oh, those headaches you're having, they're just stress tension migraines. Very dismissive. And that was something we saw a lot 40 or 50 years ago. A lot of male physicians, very dismissive of women. Thankfully, I think it's changing a bit now. Many of you may have experienced this type of stuff. They're very, oh, you're premenstrual, that type of stuff. That's horrible. To me, that's totally unacceptable to dismiss people. Sclerosis are the hard areas. These are the kinds of disturbances. Make sure you supplement vitamin D. A lot of good things from it. We don't do the fibers. You'll be happy to know. And if you're curious, local anesthetics work by blocking those voltage-gated sodium channels. Very, very interesting. Cold can do it. That's when you feel like your hand or your foot's falling asleep. You're cutting off blood supply, etc. Thank you. We will start the next unit, which is neurotransmitters in the synapse. Super important on Wednesday. Pop in the